Now let's have a look at types of coupling. So one of the couplings are content coupling. Content coupling is when there are two classes and one class can access the private members of another class. Many of programming languages don't allow this. For example, Java and C# don't allow this. But some other programming languages such as C++ allow one class to access the private members of another class because performance is the most important thing in that programming language. However, that increases the coupling. Common coupling is when two classes access the shared data. For example, in Visual Basic, there is global variables that can be shared across multiple classes, and that basically increases the coupling. And also static properties in C# and Java also may increase the coupling. Control coupling is when a function controls the flow of another function. For example, there are two functions, one of them has a loop, but then checks the status of, for example, a variable, and another function is also changing that variable. And then one function is basically controlling the other function. That is called control coupling. Routine coupling is when a function calls another function without passing any parameters. This is very similar to common coupling when you don't pass any parameters, but instead two methods in one class are working on one shared private field, for example. Data coupling is when two systems or two components share the same database. Type use coupling is when a member or property of class B is of type class A. And stamp coupling is similar to type use coupling, but then in class B there is a method, and that method has a parameter of type class A. So if you want to replace class A with something else, you will have to change that method signature in class B. Import coupling is when a library is imported into another program. For example, in the previous lecture, I mentioned that in Windows, we have dynamic linked libraries or DLL files that have to be imported into the program or library, and then that is called import coupling. And we also have external coupling, and that is when communicating with an external program can be also a hard dependency, and we will see it shortly. So this is one example of some of these couplings. It doesn't cover everything. So what we see is one software system. The whole thing belongs to one software system, and there are three components of that software system. We have component A, component B, and component C. As you see, all these three components are using a shared database. So component C inserts records into a table called users. And then component B has a command that says, I want to query that user table with select star from users. Now, if we change the structure of the users table because component C needs to insert one more field or column, then component B is going to break because that column might be added or removed, and then the query is going to fail and component B is going to fail. So as you see, sharing one table or one database for that matter between more than one component is a high coupling problem. And another problem here is that component C is a DLL file and component A has imported that DLL to use it. Now, as we said before, if component C gets replaced with something else, you need to change the code in component A to accommodate for that. So that is a high coupling. And component B is providing API, but that API is a SOAP API. If you don't know what SOAP API is, it's basically there is an XML file that defines the signature of all the methods in that API and how authentication works and data types and everything. And both the dependent and dependency, which means component A and component B, have to use that XML and generate classes and data types so that they can talk to each other. Now, if we change that XML, both component A and component B have to change their code. We have to go and modify them to accommodate for that change in the XML file. And that is why you don't hear from SOAP APIs anymore, or you don't see that anymore unless you see it in legacy systems, and RESTful APIs have replaced that because there is no dependency on that intermediate XML.